This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to Balanced Debate for the Old North State. Well, when this week started, Governor Cooper had 78 bills on his desk awaiting approval, and we'll talk about what actions he took on the most important legislation, as well as what happened to those he vetoed. We've got two court decisions worth discussing. The first, a U.S. Supreme Court decision on gerrymandering, and a federal judge's decision regarding judicial primaries. And it wouldn't be NC Spin if we didn't ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Joining us on this week's panel, including Howard Lee, former senator and former chair of the State Board of Education; John Hood, syndicated columnist and author; Chris Fitzsimon, political analyst and columnist; and Becki Gray, vice president of the John Locke Foundation. Well, we'll begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages by our underwriters.
In rural North Carolina, vibrant main streets depend on a thriving agricultural economy. Research at NC State improves the products our farmers raise and grow. NC State Extension brings that research from labs to fields in all 100 counties, which means growth for rural North Carolina. At NC State, what we think and do helps grow local economies. Discover how NC State and Extension work for you. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Agriculture. It's North Carolina's #1 economic driver. It puts people to work. It powers our economy. And as agriculture grows, so does our quality of life. North Carolina Farm Bureau is proud to support agriculture and our farmers because agriculture connects us all.
Let's get to it. It's always called the silly season as the legislation wraps up for the session. Not only has the short session been silly at times, but it's been proceeding at a breakneck pace. As this week opened, Governor Cooper had 78 bills on his desk awaiting approval or veto, and we want to discuss some of the more significant ones and talk about what might happen. Start off with Becki Gray. The legislature started this week by overturning two Cooper vetoes, and as we head toward the end of the month, any prediction as to when lawmakers might adjourn Sine Die?
Well, it's looking like we're getting close. Speaker Moore said this week that by next Friday, a week from today, he expected to be able to adjourn. Tom, what we're seeing in this final week, allegedly, hopefully, is constitutional amendments, local bills, nothing controversy. But the other big thing is, as you mentioned, there's 78 bills sitting on the governor's desk. They're waiting to see what he does. I think we're going to talk about it, but several look like he might veto. They want to give themselves time. Those are due to come over from the governor by Monday. So we'll see what happens there. But it looks like they're winding down by the end of the fiscal year.
Let's get into some of the constitutional amendments because there are two or three of them that are fairly controversial, Howard. I guess the voter ID bill is constitutional amendment is back up. Speaker Moore says they've got the voter ID will have no effect whatsoever on our elections. Do you agree or disagree?
Oh, I disagree. I think that it will have an impact because there are so many people who simply don't have a voter ID, and some don't even know how to go about getting one. Now, maybe we could help them out over time, but I'm not a great fan of the voter ID. I think it's a solution running around looking for a problem.
John, why do we have to have a constitutional amendment for this? Only 3 states have constitutional amendments.
Well, it isn't to clear a legal bar, really, because it doesn't matter whether it's a state law or a constitutional amendment to the state constitution. If there is a federal violation, it's not going to make any difference. I think the main reason to put it in the Constitution is to prevent some future legislature from, with just a simple majority, changing or overturning the requirement. I think that it would be an overstatement to say that instituting voter ID would have absolutely no effect on the elections or on the propensity of anyone to turn out, but I think it is fair to describe the effect as very small.
Chris, I was going to ask you, have you seen the ads that have started popping up saying that if we pass voter ID that we may not get Apple and Amazon?
Well, yeah, I have seen those, and my concern about this, a new practice, which is a relatively new practice, we don't know what kind of voter ID it will be. I was really interested that Jerry Cohen was tweeting and writing at the end of this week about many times he would write the enabling legislation that would go with the amendment, so people knew what they were voting on. This General Assembly remember, a court said, has attacked minority voting rights with surgical precision, and that was upheld by the Supreme Court, in effect, the U.S. Supreme Court.
It was not upheld by the Supreme Court.
Well,
it never was even taken up by the court
the court rejected it.
Because the governor and the attorney general sabotaged the case.
Here's a good point. The court rejected that appeal, number one. Number two, we don't know. I mean, we're asking voters to approve a concept, and we're going to let the legislature decide what that is. I would be much more comfortable, and this is going to happen, I think, with other amendments, if the legislature would lay out in legislation what they plan to do before the voters are asked to approve
we don't know
what
the ID requirement is.
Right. It just says a voter ID as prescribed by law. So there was some discussion this week, too, as this amendment was moving through the General Assembly and committee and debate of what does that mean. Now, Jerry Cohen, as Chris mentioned, did testify by videotape. One of the things that was interesting about that, and I think it's significant, is some of the points that Jerry made, the General Assembly leaders had viewed beforehand, had gone back and corrected, made amendments to the bill. So some of that clarification is being done, and I suspect that we'll see more of that before it's actually put on the ballot for us.
Well, Howard, polls say this thing is overwhelmingly popular with the electorate. So is there any possibility that if it does get put to a constitutional vote, that it'll pass?
Oh, I think it stands a very good chance of passing, and that's what bothers me, is because the electorate is being controlled by a very targeted argument on why this is a problem. And I'm concerned that while it may not have a direct impact on people voting, it certainly psychologically will impact people feeling comfortable going to the polls. I mean, I went to the polls the last time, and I immediately didn't know that we didn't need the ID, so I'm popping out my ID.
I did too.
But at the same time, I wish we would put more energy toward helping people get to vote and not preventing vote.
John, the other constitutional amendment that seems to be raising quite a ruckus is capping the state income tax. The business community, which has been largely silent in speaking out on issues, is opposing this particular amendment because they're saying it's tying the hands of the legislature for the future when we don't know what the future is going to bring. What do you think?
I think that I'm not sure what you mean. The business community does not oppose this amendment.
A lot of business, yes,
there are
a lot of business organizations are opposing it.
Not that I'm aware of. There are a few individuals that were recruited by some progressive groups to claim to be representing the business community. They get to say what they think as an individual. The business community as a whole is either for or neutral on this, as far as I know. I have my own concerns about it. I'd rather cap overall taxes, or I'd rather cap spending growth. I think that would be a better approach. But I think this does represent, it's going to be capped at higher than the current, what will be the current income tax rate. So it doesn't mean that the future legislature couldn't raise the income tax by a quarter point. They couldn't go beyond that above 5.5%.
Well, I think it's important to note, too, that our personal income tax in North Carolina is already capped. I mean, in our Constitution today, it's at 10%. What this proposal would do would be to lower that to 5.5%. With this budget that will go into effect, it's 5.25%.
I'm still at a loss as to why we want to tie the hands of future members of the General Assembly.
Well, it's always been a policy. We haven't done this in the past.
And it's such a high level. Nobody's ever advocated a 10% income tax. And I think, why would we take a tool away that we might need in future legislatures? And if voters don't like what future legislatures do with the tax, they can pick new legislators and change the tax. Writing things in the Constitution which makes it virtually impossible to repeal, I think, is a terrible precedent.
Well, and Howard, in the event that we do have a case of the shorts and we can't raise income taxes, then guess what's going to happen?
We're in trouble.
Well, we're going to be raising fees and sales taxes.
Absolutely. It's going to be like some other states do it today. So I'm opposed to it so strongly that I can't really express it in words. But I just wish we wouldn't go to the Constitution to try to manage future generations.
All right. Any of the other constitutional amendments, we've got one that guarantees hunting and fishing rights. For what reason, I'm not quite sure.
Because legislators like to hunt and fish.
Well,
and we'll find out how many North Carolinians like to hunt and fish.
I think the other one that probably deserves our immediate attention has to do with judicial vacancies and the filling of judicial vacancies, which is currently handled by the governor, picking from a list. But the governor basically controls that, which has presented situations in the past where voters have said no to a judge, and then a governor has put that judge right back on the court afterwards. So this is that there was a dispute about whether there would be a change from judicial elections. That is not being proposed. This has nothing to do with judicial elections. This has to do with whether the governor by himself would choose to fill vacancies, or whether there be a process that involves legislators and perhaps the Chief Justice.
Let's look at some of these other 78 bills that may have caught your attention and try to hit them as quickly as we can. Any particular ones that strike you? Chris, one of them involves prison security. There was an interesting conversation that's been going on about privacy rights for guards and
Yeah, I think this one is to protect, is to protect the rights of guard or the lives of guards and people in the prisons. I think it did get a lot of attention because of some of the discussion. There are a lot of problems in our prisons. I don't think this one is going to be quite as controversial as another one that I thought we should talk about, which is the Farm Bill or the Farm Act.
Yes, okay.
Which was a fascinating debate, especially on the House floor. The debate about how much right you have as a property owner to be able to enjoy your property with the odors from a 5,000 hog farm right beside your property. I think this one is going to be fascinating. It sort of cut across party lines. There were some individual property rights supporters who joined with generally most Democrats to vote against expanding the rights in effect of corporate hog farms. These aren't family farms. These are massive corporate hog farms. So this will be the fate of this one, I think. It's likely to be vetoed. This might be the most interesting veto override of the session.
But frivolous lawsuits were a part of this.
Well, it's
also
not very frivolous if you're smelling it.
Well, and the nuisance claims, and it really is it's a question of rights. Is that right? Which prevails, the right of the companies that are, doing this, who have been there for years, or property owners who in many cases have been there for years. And as more people move to rural areas, as these hog farms expand, that space between them gets smaller. How do you solve that? This is one, Tom, too, that I'm not sure that an override vote is a sure thing. I think that there are concerns in it. Would not be surprised if the governor vetoes this. I'm not sure that there are the votes to override that. This could be the most interesting vote that we see in this coming week.
Interesting. So you think the governor might veto it?
I think it's certainly possible. The discussion has been, can it be overridden, which in my mind, of course, obviously that assumes there's a veto involved. I wanted to mention another bill on the list, which is an education bill. The part that got the most attention had to do with math courses. If some kids weren't being assigned to the higher level math courses, even though their scores suggested they would do well, that is addressed in the bill. But another part of the bill has extensive language about what's called a renewal school district, allowing a school district, not just a restarted public school, but maybe a whole district, changing the way it operates, getting some deregulation during that period. Interesting process.
Howard, another one that I was going to raise, and I'll let you raise one also, was permanently changing the primary election dates from May until March.
Yeah, I think it's a terrible idea. I've gone through a number of processes where primary dates have been shifted from May and made earlier and made later, and it always tends to have an impact on the voting patterns of people, and that concerns me. But getting back to the point John just raised on this assignment of students to higher level courses, I think it's a sad day that the legislature has to direct schools to do that. I've been working in these schools now for about 6 years since I left the State Board of Education, and I'm just finding people don't want to assign poor kids to higher courses because they just don't think they can succeed, and I think that's a mistake.
Chris, another one was early voting. The legislature seems intent on dealing with our voting patterns.
The legislature seems intent on changing the election every session to their own advantage, no matter what it takes. And now they're eliminating the final Saturday in early voting, where I think 200,000 people voted the last time, a significant number of low-income minority voters. I don't understand the rush to continue to make adjustments in an election system that I'm not sure was broken in the first place, other than they're trying to gain partisan advantage.
I would disagree with that one from Chris's perspective. What they've done is they've just moved the early voting part back a little bit. So instead of Thursday to Saturday, it's Wednesday to Friday. The other thing that I think is really a good idea is that most people vote the last day.
The last Saturday.
The last day.
Well, and they're not working on Saturday, Becki. That's the whole point.
But here's the deal. All of those early voting sites will be open from 7 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock at night.
And you work an hour and a half from your house and you can vote on Saturday. Why would you take Saturday away? What's the goal of it?
I think the argument has to do with, you've got people who register and vote at the same time during early voting, and you need enough time to adjudicate look at those registrations. I think that's at least the process argument for what you're getting at.
It's not going to help our democracy.
For many months, observers had awaited the decision from the U.S. Supreme Court on partisan gerrymandering, hoping the court would make a definitive statement as to whether the practice was constitutional or not. But essentially, the Supreme Court's punted, remanding both of the Wisconsin and Maryland cases back to the lower courts and opening questions about North Carolina's gerrymandering case. Howard Lee, people on both sides of this political gerrymandering issue were disappointed. But it's also caused some speculation as to what's going to happen when the North Carolina case gets up there. What do you think?
Well, I'm certainly disappointed that the Supreme Court didn't take definitive action on this. They acted like a bunch of fish with broken spines. And I really thought that they were going to make a decision, but maybe they are concerned that they don't have a standing to make a definitive decision. For example, I think there's some question of how much case law is available for them to use, as well as whether or not they really do have the power to insert themselves in the redistricting process.
But they didn't decide. What they did is remanded it back to the lower courts. Is that correct?
That's
they
right.
Did. The initial coverage of this suggested it was a punt. It was just they didn't take a definitive action. But if you look more closely at both the majority decision and the concurrence, it is very unlikely that the plaintiffs will succeed on the merits if it comes back through Wisconsin, because of the way the decision was written and it's not just a test about standing. The discussion in the decision had to do with what kind of claim are people making. And the 14th Amendment claim is about an individual's right. If you live in a district and you voted for the Democrat and the Democrat got elected, it's not clear that you have been injured. So this is much more, the main point here is to look at the concurring opinion with the 4 more liberal justices desperately trying to get Anthony Kennedy to come over to them. He did not. That is the most important information from this decision.
Can we take anything from their decision so far as what might happen when North Carolina's case comes up?
Well, North Carolina's case is part of the battle. I think there was some speculation that North Carolina's case might now be more important because it's still the one out there that may get all the way to the court.
All right. Well, this past Monday, the filings for judicial elections began with some interesting side stories to spice up the race. Lawmakers didn't follow through on plans to redraw all the judicial districts in our state. Instead, they just drew new districts in Wake, Mecklenburg, Pender, and a couple of counties. Meanwhile, U.S. District Court Judge Catherine Eagles ruled there will be no judicial primaries this year. So what does Eagles' decision mean, Becki?
Well, it means that we're not going to have any primaries this year, and the elections are underway. This is a one-time thing. We're just going to have this year. The legislature had decided not to hold the primaries while they looked at judicial redistricting for the whole state, other changes that were under consideration, whether we should even elect judges were some of the things. But they made the decision to not hold a primary this year. It's a one-time thing. We still get, candidates have filed. They'll be running. We'll get to vote for them in November.
So what are we going to have? 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats running for the same?
We might very well have multiple R's or multiple D's, and that's really the point, is that the 2 parties, the 2 major parties, Republican and Democratic parties, have endorsed their preferences. But that's not the same thing as a primary. There will be could be, we don't know until the filing period is over, there could be other R's or other D's that aren't endorsed by their parties on the ballot.
Well, to me, this is another example of the horrible way we're doing things. If you really want to why do we have to have a one-time fix and do away with a chance to vote in a primary? Why don't we have a commission that has tons of people on it for a couple of years and change the way judges are elected in next year so we don't have to take a right of voters away to go to the polls? This whole judicial redistricting thing has been stopped and started and at the last minute. I think it's another.
We've had people, Howard, that filed who found out because of redistricting and they're taking place in several districts, they filed in the wrong district.
And there's nothing more disconcerting to a candidate to be prepared to go forth with a campaign and
then
not
unfile?
And how many times have the legislators complained that courts are throwing it in? We don't know when to file. Courts have made redistricting such a mess. We can't run for the legislature. We don't know where we're going to run. And now they're doing it to judges.
I really still wish we had just stayed away from this partisan identification on judges. I really think judges ought to be impartial, partial people, and while we can't change their minds about certain things. I just don't like partisanism in judiciary processes.
I just see that differently. I think that it's hard to get information about judges, and any kind of information we have. Yeah, and their party affiliation, I think, is an important part as we consider. As far as this whole thing, at the end of the day, we're all going to have more choices. We get to vote for more of we have more choices for these judicial seats, and I think that's important for the voters.
We may elect a judge with 20% of the vote, a statewide judge with 20% of the vote.
Is that good?
That's what's going to happen as a result of this.
Is the judicial election not governed by the 30% threshold?
I would assume, yes.
In which case there would be a runoff if it was at 20%. I don't know the answer to that.
Now, we've got some statewide races that, in addition to the district and superior court races, we've got some statewide races. One Supreme Court race, Barbara Jackson, who's a Republican, running against Anita Earl.
Well, those are candidates we know will file.
Yes.
But others may be in the race, right? That's what we just talked about. And the same is true with the 3 appeals court seats that are also up statewide.
And as a voter, I think having more choices is better.
But would you want somebody on the Supreme Court or another court, let's say even if there's a 30% threshold that 69% of the people did not vote for, that's going to be the person making laws for North Carolina?
That's a responsibility that we have as voters.
I don't understand
I'm not sure.
69% of the people are not going to vote for somebody, and they're going to be on the Supreme Court.
What's even worse is the larger percentage than that don't know who they're voting for.
Again, we have a responsibility as voters.
Yeah, but we have the responsibility, but I'm afraid that unfortunately it doesn't happen too many instances, particularly in some of these statewide races. So any inclination, I've seen some early polls talking about who is favored for this particular seat or that particular seat.
It's too early for those polls to be particularly meaningful, in my opinion. I mean, Civitas had a couple of different polls in 2 different months that showed significant differences in the electorate and significant differences in that Supreme Court race. I just think we'll just have to keep watching it. It's too early to tell.
I think so too.
Yeah, and should be interesting. So we will not have any judicial elections until November when we have the regular general election, correct?
That's what it looks like.
All right.
Start studying up.
There's no question about it. Speaking of studying up, it's time for us to ask the panel to study up a little bit and tell us something we don't know. Becki Gray, I'll start with you.
Well, Tom, as the General Assembly short session wraps up, I just think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of really good work that's been done. And we hear about all this partisan divide and the arguments and, nobody can agree on anything. And when you look at the over, 250 bills that will actually be enacted into law, the majority of those are done with strong majority, bipartisan at the very least. And so I just think it's important. There's also a lot of really good work done on issues that maybe don't get as much of attention. Representative Bill Brawley's doing a lot of stuff on sex trafficking that's important. Chuck McGrady and John Bell are really taking a lead on the disaster recovery across the state. Some really good work being done by good men and women.
Chris, tell us something we don't know.
Well, there's been a lot of national debate about immigration in the last couple of weeks in a variety of ways. I thought it was important to remind people there's a lot of studies that have been done, including one by the Cato Institute that I don't normally quote on this program, that shows undocumented immigrants and legal immigrants commit crimes at a far less rate than native-born Americans, and areas with high percentages of immigrants, both undocumented and documented, have lower crime rates in areas that don't. So it is simply not true that immigrants in an area increase the crime rate, as our president keeps telling us.
John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, the last couple of months, contrary to my expectations and maybe many others, North Carolina's had a bit of a growth spurt in terms of job creation in particular. The last month, the May numbers showed a 20,000 increase in net new jobs. That's a blazing rate. That puts us top 8 or so in the country.
Howard Lee, tell us something we don't know.
Warren County has introduced an interesting process of students making a choice as to which school they'd like to attend. It's a choice between the student and the parent. I think school systems needs to review how parents and students can be engaged in deciding which school they'd like to attend, and if they choose the school closest to home, give them preference to that assignment.
Could really open up a lot of worms there, couldn't we? Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Join us next week. We're going to have a really interesting show for you. We hope you'll join us for that. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
In rural North North Carolina, vibrant main streets depend on a thriving agricultural economy. Research at NC State improves the products our farmers raise and grow. NC State Extension brings that research from labs to fields in all 100 counties, which means growth for rural North Carolina. At NC State, what we think and do helps grow local economies. Discover how NC State and Extension work for you. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Agriculture. It's North Carolina's #1 economic driver. It puts people to work. It powers our economy. And as agriculture grows, so does our quality of life. North Carolina Farm Bureau is proud to support agriculture and our farmers because agriculture connects us all.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.